Okay, great. Thank you to Sampath and the Rashtam team for this invitation. We have had a very comprehensive coverage of various points around this rather contentious subject. What I am thinking of doing is bring about a few points from Sri Aurobindo's. I'm not an expert in Varna and Jati per se, but a few points that come up from a philosophical perspective and related to what has already been mentioned here. I think it will add to the discussion. And now let me start off by one of the questions that came up, I saw in the chat, that how did this degeneration that Kundan mentioned, there has been a certain degeneration of an original deeper significance into something which is not so beneficial, something which is crude and in many ways undesirable. Now, question came up that how did this ossification happen? How did this degeneration happen? There is a kind of answer Sri Aurobindo himself provides, which I will try to propose as an explanation for why this has happened, why this degeneration happened. And this ties into the whole movement of nature in the evolution of mankind itself. Mankind began in the earlier days, in the days of the original spiritual heritage. The rishis actually operated from an intuitive level of consciousness. There's somebody asking a question, but I probably will take it at 12 o'clock since we'll have enough time after that. Now, what happened is that whilst a few rishis operated from an intuitive level of consciousness, the larger part of society kind of operated at an infrarational level or at a sub-rational level, more instinctive level. So it was the intention of nature throughout the world and also in India to have a much wider proliferation of the intellectual mental development in humanity, in a larger section of humanity, to then go back to reclaiming the intuitive power. So this is the whole thing about the height as well as the widening in the process of natural evolution, so that there is a stronger and a more secure foundation as the evolution of consciousness happens through ascent and integration. So we are going back to the root of this whole issue as to why did this happen. And Varna Jati is just one exemplification of a much broader trend of the evolution of human consciousness itself. To make the mental, rational, the intellectual foundation strong, we have about 2 millennia of cultural development in which Europe and the Western world have actually taken more covert and wider leaps in terms of outer forms of human endeavor. And that is why we have a much more overt and well-known development of Western philosophical thought and even physical sciences in the West. And India, although having originated many of these in an earlier age, kind of went into covert mode, right? If we map this trajectory of consciousness to social development, we find an answer that Sri Aurobindo provides in his nomenclature of social development in the human cycle. So just to quickly capture, in the human cycle, he builds on Lamprecht's terminology to actually trace the cycle of social development in a collective sense, which maps the individual psychology, because ultimately the collective is the sum total of individuals. So Sri Aurobindo names 5, taking on from Lamprecht's terminology, 5 stages of social development. But unlike in the West, where it is defined usually through outer forms and means, Sri Aurobindo meant it from a psychological position. So he defines the symbolic, the typal, the conventional, the individual rational, and the subjective. And these have to be, because this is not physical material science, this is to be taken flexibly, that each of these are not watertight distinctions, but they all blend into each other. They blend into each other in every individual as well as in every society. But to the point that Kundan mentioned, there's a certain predominance, and that predominance at a particular time frame helps us characterize the social developmental stature with that particular term. So the symbolic is essentially the stage of social development where mankind discovers his relationship with nature, and the outer forms are not taken for their literal value, but the upper echelons of society who have developed the intuitive level of consciousness try to look for a meaning behind the symbol. So symbolic represents the quest for deeper, higher, and inner truths behind outer symbols. So if one were to think of the dispensation of spirit in the typological development of the individual and the corporate existence, one can map the 4 Varnas to 4 parts of the divine body. If one were to symbolically anthropomorphize, to make an anthropomorphic representation, we have the mouth representing something, the Brahman, the arms representing the Kshatriyas, the thighs representing the Vaishyas, and the feet representing the Shudras. This is not a question of inferiority or superiority in the way it is being promulgated today, largely as a result of, or to a certain extent, the British, But this has to be seen as an overall constitution of the divine body that requires the fullness of expression of the intention of spirit in manifestation, right? So this symbolic understanding of the parts of the divine body, not in a literal sense, but representative of the intention of the spirit to embody these different faculties in the social fabric through individuals, was the symbolic stage. This is the origin of the Varna system. Now, if you take the next stage as typal basically means that every individual exercises a certain leaning, a certain preference based on inner nature, disposition, hidden competency, developmental imperative, all of these things, and therefore makes a choice of what he or she would like to do, how he or she would like to operate and contribute to the overall totality of social development. So there is a mapping of individual development to social development. So the typal indicates that every person makes a choice on he or she would like to do. And this has to be flexible, because this is not just a watertight one-time denomination of a role, but a part of a self-developmental progression of an individual. Every individual within a particular life may choose the path of knowledge, may choose the path of leadership, administration, and even war, may choose the path of interaction and relationship and mutuality and exchange, and may choose the path of unconditional service, including the performance of menial tasks. And every individual has the freedom, or ought to have the freedom, to even choose the sequence or the parallelism of these choices. Some of these can be parallel, some of these can be in series. So from the symbolic, we move to the typal. From the typal, we move to the conventional, which is where humanity moved from an intuitive clearly to a mental mode of consciousness, or approached a mental mode of consciousness through the adherence to conventions. A conventional society is a society where the outer form or the function or the ritual or the mechanical act unfortunately ends up assuming a greater significance than the inner truth of which the form is just a representation. So it is unfortunate, yet it was necessary in the progression of nature, as we discussed earlier, for there to be a conventional age. And I would say that more than the Western world, India or large parts of India are still stuck at the conventional level of mental development, where going to the temple and chanting something or giving an offering and then coming back and doing a corrupt act and almost trying to justify the fact that because I have done the chanting, this will be forgiven. That is what is called the conventional mode of thinking. In Western developmental psychology, this is called the mythic mode of operation. Now, needless to say, conventional had to make way for what is called the individual rational. This is the fourth stage in Lamprecht and Aurobindo's elaboration. The individual rational is where all conventions are questioned. As you can see, this is absolutely necessary so that society does not get strangulated in the encrustation of conventionalism. There needs to be and has been the individual rational, where every individual questions every convention and demands answers from a place that has to satisfy his or her own mental questioning. And unless the answer is satisfactory, which he or she can derive from himself or from outside, he or she can choose to refuse the convention. And that is what has happened. If you look at medieval Europe, the whole Reformation movement was of iconoclastic rejection of the ecclesiastical imposition of the church. The whole reason Buddhism surfaced in India much earlier was because some of the ossification of the ritualism, the encrustation which happened from the deeper symbolic meaning of the Vedic philosophy, had to be dismantled through epistemological anarchism. Buddhism was nothing but a movement of epistemological anarchism. And of course, the other aspect of it was stepping away from the movements of nature. And then we have, so the larger point is that the individual rational has also happened in India a bit later, and there has been a strong gap in between, which is a very important civilizational feature that again maps back to the importance of the completion of the four Varnas. So just to complete the earlier story, after the individual rational is the subjective age. This is the spiritual, this is the advent of the spiritual age, provided we have true subjectivism and not false subjectivism. Not ego-based introspection, but a universal opening and widening of the consciousness to the larger realms of spirit. And the subjective age is the age that we, or at least the leading age of today's consciousness, is. It is from the subjective age that we can actually move into a true spiritual age, and the true spiritualization of society can happen. In the subjective age, we go back on a broader frame of an intellectual development over 2 millennia. We go back and reclaim the intuitive power of human consciousness, but over a much stronger, wider, and a much more secure foundation. Which is why this discussion today is extremely pertinent, because man has today reached the end, or has hit the law of diminishing returns as far as the mental, individual, rational age of consciousness is concerned. He is going around in circles. So this is the time to reclaim the true subjectivism and to reclaim the hidden significance of the typological construction and stratification of society, symbolic of the divine dispensation for the individual and corporate existence of society in its totality. Now, what is the proof? One may ask, what is the proof that all four are required in a society? Well, what had happened, I would say, as he mentions in the Foundations of Indian Culture, that actually because of the nature of the inner journey that the Indian spirituality took through Buddhism, which rejected nature as a domain of suffering, and through the monistic Advaita philosophy, which rejected the operations of nature as some form of illusion. There was a renunciation of the vitality of life in some sense or form, and a renunciation of Shakti. And when you renounce Shakti, Shakti renounces you. So we find that one could say that the Kshatriya, the Kshatra Tej, and the Vaishya Tej took a kind of a backseat. And Indian society was only on two legs, of the Brahmin and the Shudra. And the hypothesis, this is the point that Ashish also made, there's a very strong hypothesis and a reason to suppose that a large part of the outer impoverishment of the Indian civilization and its susceptibility to attacks from outside was because of the erosion and desiccation of this vitality due to the withdrawal of Shakti. The totality of spirit, that was the vision of the Vedic symbolic, and then the intellectual philosophical Vedanta and the Upanishadic age, as if took a back seat, and Indian civilization went through what it had to go through. Be that as it may, our task is a full reclamation of the power of spirit, of the spiritual intention in its totality, and revitalize all four aspects of the divine dispensation, both within society and within every individual. I and you need to discover and hone the faculty of knowledge as much as the faculty of the fighting spirit, as much as the faculty of reciprocity and mutuality and exchange, as much as the humility of unconditional service. And this we need to do not only within this life, but across lives. So if we take the whole rebirth principle, society, through its ossification and through its rigidification, has no locus standi to determine what my swabhava is. Not just the swabhava in this life, which leads to my swadharma, but the progression, the evolutionary soul progression of my swabhava across lives. In a previous life, typologically, I may have been through a warrior experience. And therefore, to complement the totality of my own self-development, I may need to go through a knowledge cycle in this life or in the first part of this life. You see, who can determine this? Can society have any clue about this? Not only not society, even the individual does not have a clue about it unless he or she begins to live in the inner self and reclaim the connection with the psychic being. Only when the whole truth and the purpose of his existence becomes clear to him. So Varna is a symbolic representation of a certain mode or a certain mix of gunas, to the point that Kundan mentioned. And this mix of gunas is a trajectory that every individual has to take in relational harmony and equilibrium with the rest of society, with other individuals like him, so that there is a holistic, harmonious progression and a harmonious interchange between individual development and social development. This is a very complex matter. This has to be determined from the inner law of the spirit and not through any outer convention, because the outer convention by its very nature is ill-equipped to even deal with this, to even understand this, let alone deal with it. The last point I'll make just for one more minute, one has to look at the inner significance and the outer form. And if one looks at the distinction between the inner significance of the four varnas and the outer form, one automatically gets a sense of interoperability and fluidity, right? If you look at the Brahmin, the outer form is what? Religious ministration, teaching, instruction. But what is the true inner significance? Ascesis, purity, practice of spiritual truth, right? Similarly, the Kshatriya, the outer form may be government, politics, leadership. What is the inner significance? The warrior spirit, protection, chivalry, courage, isn't it? The outer form of the Vaishya might be business or mercantilism or commerce. What is the inner significance? Relational exchange, harmony, unity through mutuality, indifference. So there's a very deep spiritual truth behind this. Shudra may be a servant or a menial worker or a laborer. But as we said, the inner significance is self-offering. Now, it can become clear that even while being in a so-called outer form of a Kshatriya, I might be a business leader or a king or a political leader, but nothing prevents me from having and invoking the inner, all four inner significances in that role. Whilst being a leader or a manager, I need to have ascesis. I need to have ascesis in terms of the dominion of soul over nature. Of course, I need to have the warrior spirit. I also need to have relational exchange and mutuality. It is not that I have to be a businessman to invoke the inner spirit of mutuality. I can do it being a Brahmin in the outer form, or a Kshatriya in the outer form, even a Shudra in the outer form. So, when one tries to map the inner with the outer, one sees the complete ludicrousness of the rigidification, which happens when the mental level of consciousness operates where it deals only with representations rather than the inner truth of things. And that understanding is required for us to be able to invoke these principles within ourselves so that we can achieve the yogic station of the Trigunatīta. And I think with that, I will hand over to Manan and invite any questions if there are.
Thank you, Nilesh. Thanks for the very important enumeration of the cycles of human society, which is also very fascinating and does make a lot of